Good morning, and welcome to today's Focus Ultrasound Foundation webinar entitled Indication Selection Through the Eyes of an Investor. My name is Patrick Edelman, and I serve as a strategic advisor to the foundation with an eye towards helping our efforts within the FUS Partners program. As we think about the ever-expanding indication universe for the use of Focus Ultrasound, it will become more important each day for entrepreneurs and investors to think about where the best shots on goal will occur. We're all here because we believe in the potential of what this technology can do, and it is critical that as we uncover opportunities, we think about how that aligns with others in the ecosystem, including the capital that will come from investors. We thought it would be great to have one of the leading minds discuss how they think about indication selection through their own eyes. We're so fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Erich Scheller. I'll let Eric give a bit about his background, but we are blessed to have developed a relationship with a firm of RA Capital's caliber. RA has been a great partner with the foundation as we ourselves think about the allocation of our own resources and the market opportunities that exist in the field. So with that, I'll pass it off to Eric for a brief introduction. And then as he finishes, we'll address any questions from the audience entered through the Q&A function below. Eric, the stage is yours.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today to do a little walkthrough of what we do here at RA Capital. Basically, how do we think about mapping the competitive landscape within the biotech space? And this is largely thinking of these opportunities from a buy-side investor, which is what RA Capital is. So a little introduction for myself. So I'm Erich Scheller. I'm the director of TechAtlas here at RA Capital. TechAtlas is our internal research group here at RA that focuses on really understanding the core scientific questions behind all the opportunities that we diligence. And they work across the investment teams, whether it's our early venture capital or our late stage public equity investing that we might be doing. For myself, I'm a PhD by training. So I did my PhD down at UNC Chapel Hill and have since joined RA now 6 years ago. First in the associate role, so focusing on doing that diligence and doing that competitive landscape mapping, primarily in the oncology space. And I've since grown into now leading this organization, which is now 25 plus PhDs or advanced degrees in the sciences, as well as a group of graphics team, writing team, and an additional research team that kind of lets all of this work together. Because RA Capital is a regulated investment firm, we need to make a couple of disclosures up front. So anything I say during this presentation or show in this presentation is really for discussion purposes only and is not intended to solicit investment in our fund or any other fund, nor does it constitute an offer to sell, solicit to buy, or a recommendation for any security or company that we might discuss. So basically, at the end of the day, do not take anything I'm about to say as an investment advice, but rather just the opinion for discussion for how the competitive landscape maps might impact the competitive landscape views of a given space or target. Now, who is RA Capital? What is it that we do? So we're a multi-billion-dollar, multi-stage investment manager with company creation capabilities. And really the ultimate goal is we want to be investing in discovery and development stage biotechnology innovation to really bring impact to patients. And in order to understand how it is that we do what we do, it's important to understand sort of what are those core financing nuts and bolts. When you say venture capital or hedge fund, or in our case, multi-stage, what does that actually mean? And how could it potentially fit with some of the work that you all are doing? And so in our case, really what a multi-stage fund means is that we can invest in the best ideas regardless of where we find them. And that includes really building a company if it doesn't even yet exist. So if one of you were to have an idea that you wanted to put some capital behind, you could come to us in the same way that if you already have a company that exists and you're getting ready to IPO and take them into the public markets, similarly, you can come to us and we would be able to invest in you. And so the way that this works is you really have this NewCo idea, these funnel of ideas that come through, and many of them will get a little bit of seed funding to see if there's actually something there. We consider this sort of company creation or NewCo creation, and for many of these, they sort of die on the vine, but some of them actually get a little momentum. At which point you start considering, let's build a company around this and let's start advancing towards additional funding. So often this might be a term that you're familiar with, and this is where a traditional venture capital firm would play, would be the series A, B, C. Really, how do you take an idea that is possible and start, turning it into something that is probable? And usually this is where the series early stages of investing are trying to de-risk that asset, getting it to something, potentially ready for the clinic. Now, eventually, these companies, as they continue to grow, there's two ways to continue to raise capital. You continue to do that privately, or you will then leverage the capital in the public markets and eventually IPO. And so there's a term of sort of what is the last private round before that IPO, and that's a round called the crossover round. And why this round is important is because typically the way venture funds are structured and the way that they work, often they're either not built to manage money in the public markets, or at some point they need to give their money back to their limited partners, their LPs. And so often what you want to do is you want to bring in a different type of investor as your company gets ready to go IPO, companies that are familiar with the public markets and can support that growth into that next phase. So the crossover round is typically where you'll find investors like that. And the goal is to continue to capitalize this company. And then, from the crossover, having a strong internal support, then you can actually IPO and get your company public. And over these two rounds, the goal is to really raise, a bunch of capital to make sure that you have a well-capitalized public company that have really compelling clinical programs. Because at this stage, many of these, very rarely do companies actually have any revenue coming in. And so in that point, you really are, burning a lot of capital to get to the next value inflection point. And so the goal through this crossover and IPO is to make sure that these companies have as much capital as possible to hopefully achieve success. Now, occasionally, and actually not occasionally, more often than not, these companies need to continue to raise as either their assets are successful and generate data and achieve the next milestone, or they potentially fail or have underwhelming results, and the company then needs to pivot to another asset in their pipeline. At the end of the day, the goal are to really either get a company to profitability, so they get a drug approved or a device approved or an approach approved that can then start generating revenue, or what is more often likely to happen is these companies will be acquired by a big pharma partner. Often, big pharma is scouring the landscape to supplement their own dwindling R&D capabilities, and in such, you want to make sure that you have a good assets from external innovation kind of being brought in. So those are the two possible exits. Obviously, the third alternative is that the assets fail and the company ends up winding down. So a question we often get, and you might be wondering yourselves as well, is what does it take to make an investment recommendation? What is it that RA Capital or really any investor might be caring about? Were you to come to them pitching them an idea or an investment opportunity? So for us, we first want to understand what is the given disease? What is it that you're trying to solve? Is it cancer? In which case, the questions we would care about are falling within one bucket. Is it Alzheimer's disease? Any disease in between? For each of those, it's important for us to understand because we can then start thinking about what are the key questions, what are the de-risking events that we care about as you continue to execute on your business plan. What is the current treatment paradigm? So this is a really helpful one because in diseases where they're well treated, we'll use maybe multiple sclerosis, for example. The questions and what we're going to evaluate is going to be very different than in a disease, for example, where there's really not a lot of treatment options. SMA is an example of that, where for these babies there was really nothing until the gene therapies and the oligos that come around that really make a huge impact. Depending on what that landscape looks like, again, raises different questions for us as we evaluate an investment opportunity. And not only do we need to know what's already approved, what's already being used, but what are the technologies in development? And this is equally as important because we want to make sure that if we're investing in an opportunity, that it's not necessarily the best one, but that it's sort of future-proof, right? It's going to where the puck is going to be, skating to where the puck is going to be, versus where the puck might already be. What an example of that would be is if you're developing something that is potentially really interesting and generating some good data, but there's something even better a year or two behind. It's important that we know that because while you might see short-term success, if that other drug actually does work out really, really well, there might not be a market for you after that first year or two after launch. And then finally, we want to understand how are these assets similar to one another, different, and possibly complementary. And I think in the case of focused ultrasound, this is where a big question that you might be considering is where does this technology really unlock the potential of other assets that are already out there? But all of this together really gets us a sense of what is that competitive landscape? What are all the things that really matter if you're trying to solve breast cancer? So that's really the whole idea behind this TechAtlas mapping platform is to really understand, as much of that competitive landscape as possible. And this becomes to be a bigger and bigger need as the biotech industry continues to grow at a rapid pace. We just see data constantly of new assets being developed, data sets coming out from existing assets, ideas that are having companies formed around them. And it's important that we can not only create a framework to understand all of those, which is really what these maps are, but also use that as a tool to explain to one another, both internally as well as externally, why something is potentially really interesting. So we're a company to come in and pitch us on an asset for neuropathic pain. We want to understand the mechanism, what is there a subset of neuropathic pain they're going after, and that allows us to then contextualize that asset fits into X bucket, and when we're evaluating it, we need to think about all of these other companies when we think about whether or not there's a good asset here. So with that, I'm going to switch over to a PDF and walk you through a little bit of how we do this specifically within the breast cancer space. All right, so this is one of our therapeutics maps. In this case, we're looking at breast cancer and all the assets that are in development here. TechAtlas maps the world in a few ways. We can look at it from a disease-specific case, so in this case, breast cancer. We can also look at the maps from a modality standpoint. And what I mean by that is, immuno-oncology is a modality or an approach that can tackle all sorts of different cancers, or gene therapy is a modality that can be used across a variety of diseases. And so between these two mapping structures, we actually have a very nice complementary portfolio where we can not only understand what's critically important about a disease, but also taking a step back to then think about what are all the things that matter for a given approach or modality. So the way these maps are structured is we have what's kind of centrally important here in the center, in which case, and I'll zoom in here in a second, for breast cancer, what is it we're actually trying to do? And then on the very ends, if you kind of spoil it, we result in all of the companies, their phase of development, when's the next data readout. But we also pack these maps with a bunch of additional information as well, which I'll take the time to walk through as well. So if we were to start for breast cancer, as I said, we teach what's critically important about each of the drug or each of the disease. So in the case of breast cancer, you're actually treating, you need to understand, what type of breast cancer are you treating? Are you treating HR positive tumors, in which case you're going to look at these estrogen, targeting, endocrine therapies? Are you targeting HER2 positive tumors, in which case you're going to be looking at drugs that might be targeted against HER2? Or are you in the triple negative space, or are you an approach that can go across all of breast cancer, in which case you're going to be looking at these mechanisms that are orthogonal to these endocrine and HER2 signaling modalities? And then if you were to, like I had said, skip to the punchline, you end up with the companies themselves. And so in the case here, we have this macrogenics margetuximab. We have additional info in here is, it's delivered IV and it's, once every 3 weeks. We, highlight, when do we expect data? In the case of when this map was updated, we were expecting data from this drug in, first quarter of 19. The 3 dots indicate that it was in phase 3 in development. And we have this little caret to also tell us that it's being run, plus chemotherapy in third-line metastatic breast cancer. So, fundamentally, this is how the maps are laid out. Key information in the middle, drugs all the way in the end. And we'll get to an example of kind of walking through these specifically, but I do want to highlight some of the other aspects of this map first. So some of the other important data pieces, if we get to some of the things we'll discuss later in the presentation, we often include what is the relevant data that we care about, what are the benchmarks as we evaluate any new drug that might be coming through. So in the case of HER2 neoadjuvant setting, we have what were all the trials run and what was the disease-free survival and the pathological complete response rates for all of these assets. So just to not belabor it, but you could see here that when you were looking at Herceptin plus T, which in this case is paclitaxel docetaxel, you saw that the 5-year DFS was 81%, and the pathological complete response was 39%. You can compare that to other trials in this case where Herceptin plus Perjeta was similarly run. So again, this is just the data sets that we care about for when the next asset looking at neoadjuvant HER2 breast cancer, we can really know what are the benchmarks we need to be evaluating it by. Another piece that is interesting and potentially more so for you all as you think about where focused ultrasound might be able to have an impact in, especially if you're thinking about it and combining with a checkpoint inhibitor. We need to understand, when not only what are all the drugs in development, but when are we going to see data and who else is running these trials and what's working and what's not. So in the case here, we call this our milestone. Really, what are these data inflection points? And so just to give the example here, if you were to look at the adjuvant setting for, in this case, triple negative breast cancer, what are the assets that are being run? And we have Roche's Tecentriq, Pfizer's Bavencio, a couple other assets as well. Are they being combined with anything? And then when do we expect data? So in the case of Roche's PD-1 inhibitor and adjuvant HER2 setting in combination with chemotherapy, we are expecting to have RCT data actually at the beginning of next quarter, if this milestone still holds up. And we can see where have other drugs succeeded or failed. So in the case of Roche's Tecentriq in metastatic frontline, they got accelerated approval, or were expected to get accelerated approval in 2019 versus Celldex's drug in salvage setting failed. So this is a way for us to not only know what's upcoming, to know what are the valuable data sets that we're going to care about, but also see a little bit of the history, what has already worked, what already hasn't, to really help us understand that full picture of the space. And then two more before we get into going through a portion of this map itself. So we have here what we call solution development, in which case I won't spend a ton of time going over, but it's really a way for us to think about what are the combinability, what are the strategics have the assets and where might there be some synergy. And so really just to do a really quick example. So we know that these CDK4/6 inhibitors are a really important piece. They've been really transformational for HR positive tumors. But we also know that there's a ability to combine them with these estrogen receptor degraders. Right now, the one that's in the lead is I believe it's AstraZeneca's intramuscular injection fulvestrant. And one of the prevailing thoughts in the field is that what you'd want is a CDK4/6 plus an oral SERD. So if you can make a whole oral combo, that would be preferred. And so the question is, who has the pieces and what strategically would a company that has a CDK4/6 want to be acquiring? Here in the case of Pfizer, they have the leading CDK4/6 and Ibrance, and if they did want an oral SERD, they can look down here in these acquirable targets. So at the time of this map, you had Radius, G1 Therapeutics, Iventis, Arvinas, Wuxi, as well as a couple other assets that are now have since been brought to market. But again, this is a way to think about what is the competitive chess game being played out when it comes to what the strategics or Pfizers of the world might want when it comes to solving breast cancer. And then lastly, and these are pretty dense and complicated, so I won't get terribly into the depth of them. But as you think about what's the standard of care, really we need to understand where do these new assets slot in. And so we can get very, very deep into the weeds here. If we're thinking about metastatic HR positive breast cancer, it's 60% of metastatic breast cancer. 25 of them arise de novo, 25% arise de novo, 75% progress from earlier stage. Typically, the front line is a aromatase inhibitor plus a CDK4/6 or fulvestrant and CDK4/6. Depending on which of those you get, then depend on what other drugs you get. But it's a way for us to understand what is the patient sort of experience or life cycle across all of the approved therapies. And so as you were to bring an asset to us, we'd want to know where are you going to try to slot in, because that helps us think about what is the, who are you going to be competing against? Who do you need to displace to actually, make an impact on the space? So just to give a little bit of context for everything else that happens, within these maps, between the center node and ultimately the drugs, we'll focus here on this activated immune response against cancer, because that's really, I think, if we think about checkpoint inhibitors and PD-1s and where focused ultrasound might have an impact, I think this is a good example to walk through. So again, we're looking at this target mechanism orthogonally to endocrine and HER2 signaling. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can just directly kill tumor cells, traditional chemotherapy. You can try to impact the microenvironment, disrupt metastasis, or in this case, activate that immune response. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can activate the T cell response. You can suppress the pro-tumor microenvironment, or you can activate antigen presenting cells to elicit a response. If we stay within this activate T cell response, I'll zoom in here an additional layer. What is it you want to do? Do you want to amplify the existing CTL response, right? So how do you unleash what you already have? Or do you want to generate a de novo response and kind of putting something back in? If you're generating de novo, you would be thinking about the differences between a CAR T asset or potential bispecific, in which case you would be looking at approaches that are targeting these different targets with cell therapy. And at the time of this map, Bristol Myers, I think, had acquired from Celgene, one of the from that Juno asset, and UPenn had an RNA CAR-Met c-Met, as well as Macrogenics and Pfizer had a bispecific. But instead, if you want to amplify the existing CTL response, what are the ways you can go about doing it? So do you want to inhibit the T cell fusion pathway? So that's the targeting checkpoint receptors. Do you want to provide growth factors, co-stim factors? Again, we'll just stay within this inhibit T cell immune evasion pathways. And this is really where you get into some of the validated approaches, right? So can you block the inhibitory PD-1, PD-L1/2 pathway, or do you want to do some of these other pathways? So, blocking CTLA4, blocking multiple things in the case of here, PD-1 and TGF-beta, B7H4, LAG3, and then even within PD-L1, PD-1, PD-L1, you have do you block PD-1, do you block the ligands? So again, everything here is kind of teaching what are all the differences between the assets that you might be thinking about. And again, we get into the assets themselves. So in the case of blocking PD-1, we have the Mercks, the Bristols, and the Novartises of the world. What is the phase of development? When do we expect data? Similarly for CTLA4, when did we expect data from Bristol? And so the way that this is helpful for us is if we evaluate these IO assets, we can see sort of what are all the stages of development, who's trying to do what, and what are all the different ways that they're trying to do it. And so again, in the case of focused ultrasound technology, this would be a great way to create that short list of if we think that there's reason that this might work really, really well with a Yervoy or a CTLA4 inhibitor, really, Bristol's the only game in town, versus if you think this would really work best with a checkpoint inhibitor, regardless of the approach, then it really opens up, all of these other, key players that you might want to reach out to, or potentially, run a combo trial yourself in. So I'll pause there. We can, if you have more questions on the map, we can discuss those at the end. Otherwise, let's jump back to the presentation. All right, so we showed you a little bit of what we look at when we think about these competitive landscape maps. And so we want to get a little bit to, not only do we need to understand the landscape, but what other elements do we really care about when we evaluate a company and really think about its value proposition. So the first question that we ask about is, what is it worth if it works, right? That's really the, at the end of the day, if a company is, based off of and valued off of the disease that they're treating and kind of what the peak revenues might be, this is the first question that is really kind of core to any investment thesis that we make. So obviously higher is better. So is there a pretty large market, or is it really, really small? And, is it, is the diagnosis and treatment rate pretty high, in which case it's easy to find those patients, or is it going to be a disease where you're going to have to really dig to find each and every one of those patients in what might already be a very small market? Similarly, are the margins high? Obviously that's very clearly beneficial versus a low margin product when you think about what something would be worth. What's the competitive landscape? Again, going back to the maps, are there a bunch of other competitors in this space, in which case you're going to be fighting for small market share? Or are you really the only one or two in a space, in which case you might be splitting a market 60-40 with your competitor if you both work out well? Similarly, how long is the patent life? As you're building out these NPV models and discounted cash flows, really, how far out can you go? And the longer the patent life, obviously, the better. Is this a drug or an approach that's providing symptomatic relief? Or is it something that's sort of underlying where there's no real symptomatic relief? And so the example I would use there would be dyslipidemia and Lipitor, right? There's really no symptoms that go along with high cholesterol, yet it's critical that you take these drugs. Versus something like migraine or headache, where taking a pill or a shot has immediate or fairly quick impact on a patient. So again, all of that tends to drive adherence when it comes to whether or not you would what the market size is for this drug. And then lastly, can you what's the pricing power, right? If it's a disease that's flooded by generics and requires step throughs and everything else, pricing might be a bit challenging. Or is it an orphan disorder or cancer, where often you can price at a premium than you would in other indications? And then you want to, multiply, what is worth if it works by the probability of success. And obviously, again, higher is better. And so some of the ways you can de-risk this probability of success is your approach going after a validated target? Has somebody else already shown that this, target is a good one, or this modality works? In which case, that's awesome. That means that your approach is likely going to has probably a bit of higher success probability of success than it would against something that's going after an unvalidated target or with a modality that nobody's ever heard about. In the given disease, what's the placebo effect? An example I would use here is obesity. So for obesity trials, just the mere fact of being on an obesity trial leads to a high placebo effect for patients that aren't even on drug, versus there's other diseases where this doesn't happen. And so the reason why this matters is that can impact the trial results further down the line. Now, in the case of cancer, in which what we described in the breast cancer map, there really is no placebo effect. What are the biomarkers? Are there things that you can be measuring before you get to clinical outcomes that can help inform whether or not your drug is actually working? Or are there no great biomarkers, and you're really going to have to wait for that outcome, human data, impact on disease to really know if you have something there? Is there a high unmet need? And the reason that matters is if there is a high unmet need, typically the bar is not necessarily lower, but there's much less that you have to compete against. And it's easier to get accelerated approval or get it approved on a single arm trial versus requiring an RCT. All of that dictates how likely it is to actually get on the market and get into the hands of patients. And then lastly, are there multiple shots on goal? So in the case of cancer, for let's say a PD-1 or a checkpoint inhibitor, there are multiple shots on goal because we know that these many cancers respond to this approach, versus if you're really going after one very specific disease with this modality, you really are have one shot, and if it doesn't work out, then probability of success is very, very low. So that's the first question, right? What is it worth if it works? What's that probability of success? And then we need to know how much time and money is it going to take to create that value. So obviously, in this case, less time is better. So if you can run a shorter, smaller adaptive trial, that's clearly going to get you to approval much faster than if you need to run a 10,000 patient study over years looking at cardiovascular outcomes, right? How many patients are there? Is it going to be very easy to find them, in which case you should enroll pretty quickly? Or is it going to be a slog to find the patients that are going to respond to your approach? Is there a path to FDA fast track, in which case often will get you to approval much quicker? And is there a higher patient need? Similarly, if there's a high unmet need, patients will be clamoring to get on your trial, to really try this out. Versus if there isn't an unmet need, it's going to be, again, take a little longer to actually get that data set for approval. And then lastly, the less money, the better. So if you are a biotech company, you need to raise a boatload of money to run these trials, and there's no revenue coming in. The better you can make that money stretch, and the more shots on goal you can have with that money, ends up again being a approach that we would potentially be more interested in. So in the case of this, are there smaller trials? You need fewer trials. Can they be shorter? Again, what is that path to approval? Because every additional patient and every additional month of a trial is just additional money that needs to be spent. Is your modality one that's inexpensive to manufacture, or is it very, very complicated? In which case, not only is it going to be more difficult or more expensive to run those trials, but to even then launch the product, it's going to be a capital-intensive endeavor. Is there fewer people? Do you need 10,000 people to achieve your product, or can you achieve it with fewer people? Similarly, what's the platform place there? And then lastly, if you get into the patient need, again, if there's a high patient need for the thing that you're creating, that means you have to spend less money to get it in the hands of the people who need it from a marketing perspective. Versus if there's not a great, if there's a low patient need, you got to spend a little bit more to get that drug into the hands of the patients that it's treating. So if you take all of these things together, it then helps us understand. You take that and then you understand how understandable, excuse me, or perceivable is all of this to investors. And at the end of the day, and I'm sure this comes to no surprise, simpler is better. If there's fewer variables and fewer things that we need to think about as investors to kind of get to yes, be able to understand what it is you're trying to do, the easier it is for us to invest. But if there's a myriad of variables and things and biological risk and obscure biology behind what you're trying to do, it's going to be much, much harder for us to understand. And, then, subsequently raising money will be that much more difficult. So one of the things that we and, other investors like is this, what are the known comparables, right? Can you point me to another drug or another device to help explain what it is that you're trying to do, right? So if you can point to companies and products that would be comparable to what you have, again, in the disease you're going after and other diseases, that's helpful. Can you point at, proof of concept data that others have shown, or, controlled trials? If you can, point out that there's, many KOLs that we can talk to, or even smart investors that have invested in you already or in other similar approaches. What is the team that you've assembled? What is the publication history? All of these things, these kind of knowables that are beyond just the drug or the approach or the technology that you have, helps us, de-risk this from a understandable perceivability standpoint. So again, simpler the better. You can really simplify the story. It makes us, as investors, much easier to get to yes and to provide you that capital. So based on all these things, I wanted to give a few examples for you to think about as kind of, how we might view some of these spaces. So let's start with the fast follower. So this would be a drug that is, maybe a year or two behind, maybe a couple more behind a leading drug in a space. And one of the examples might be in, I believe in migraine, there was a lead, CGRP, and then one behind. And so this is a story that is, allows us to understand it, right? Because we know the answers to some of these questions already, right? So what is it worth if it works? It's going to be smaller than if they were the lead asset, right? Typically, if you have two assets launching into a space, the split ends up being 60 to the lead, 40 to the follower, assuming efficacy and all else is equal. And so this helps us understand if you're a fast follower, you're not going to capture all the market, you'll capture a smaller bit of it. But the nice bit is, at least as we think about this asset, is the probability of success is higher because somebody else has already kind of blazed that path. They know what endpoints they need to look for. They might have biomarkers already identified. It's easier for us to know the capital needs for this company. And so that lead drug has de-risked a lot of this probability of success. And so the trade-off for market size is that we already know what we need to do to get there, what good data look like. We also know that the time to get to approval is going to be a little bit higher, right? If that lead asset, if there was nothing that they had to run against, they don't need to run as long of a trial versus your fast follower might have to run a longer trial or against running in an RCT. There's going to be additional asks on you by the regulators before you be able to get approval. Similarly, we know that the money, because of these things, the time taken to execute, and the fact that there might be fewer patients out there for you to be accessing in your trial, or even when you do launch, the money value is also going to be higher. It's going to take more to get there than it would have for the lead asset. But all this is very perceivable. Again, this is a story that we're familiar with. You see this happen all the time in spaces where innovation is kind of running in parallel with multiple assets. And so for us, this story is fairly straightforward. We'll then switch over to Alzheimer's disease. So in this case, what is it worth if it works? It's huge. There's not much out there for these patients. It's a huge unmet need, huge patient population. It's only going to get larger as these populations continue to get older. But the probability of success is very, very low. I mean, we see this time and time again. Just follow the news, with the exception of ALZHEIMER'S. There really has been no innovation in this space for decades. And so any new asset that comes across our door, we know that just fundamentally Alzheimer's disease is very, very hard. And so the probability of success is going to be very, very low. So anything you can do to help shift that just a little bit might help us get to yes a little bit faster than we would have otherwise. Similarly, in the case of both of these, it's a huge population. It's one that is going to require likely require outcomes or functional outcomes. And so you're going to need to run a bunch of patients, follow them out for a fairly long time. And so both of those things take a lot of time and take a lot of money. But again, this is very perceivable to us. It's a story that we've been familiar with. There have been comparables in the space for decades. And so this is a space that we really kind of understand. And this math makes sense. And so the last one that I'll leave you with is diagnostics. And this, you might put some med tech in here as well. This is actually a space that we might need to revisit the slide. So I think we're seeing now, diagnostics are really having their day in the sun. But if you were to do, again, go back to the four things we would, care about, what is it worth if it works? In this case, it's fairly low. We know that diagnostics don't get, reimbursed that well, if at all. And so there's always going to be challenges in kind of unlocking the market potential here, which to us is, we come from a, perception that just seems off, right? If you're able to diagnose something before it happens, or at least much earlier in disease, you would think that that would be worth something. But at least in the current market, though this is changing, that's really not the case. But the probability of success is high. Often for these diagnostics, you're looking at biomarkers and measuring them and, generating data around sensitivity, specificity. We kind of know the path to, success here is, I think, much easier than you might see in many therapeutics. Similarly, you can run these trials, much cheaper and, over a much shorter time than you would many other therapeutics. So again, all of these signs point to a story that is odd to us. This is what I just said, why this doesn't seem terribly, at least when we made this slide, didn't make sense, but actually now we're seeing this, the sentiment change. But again, where you have a diagnostics, these would be the things, the ways that we would think about these assets. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions here in a few minutes. But I just want to let you know, please reach out to us. You can go to our website. We have a variety of resources on there. If you visit our knowledge tab, and under our perspectives, you can get more insights that RA might have about the space. Similarly, if you're interested in COVID, we've made all of our COVID maps publicly available, so you can evaluate those at your leisure as well. And then lastly, if you have an idea, an opportunity that you would like to discuss with us, please just reach out, and I will connect you with the right folks internally. So with that, I will thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to do that, kind of giving a very thorough, walkthrough of how you guys look at target indication selection, et cetera. I've got a few questions for you as others kind of begin to roll in. So maybe I'll just start with kind of mine off the bat. So you did that great example of kind of what it's worth and probability of success. And when you guys speak to companies, entrepreneurs, early stage companies, where often you kind of see investors or entrepreneurs making the mistakes themselves as they're modeling out the opportunity set for themselves. Is it what the asset in the market is often worth? Is it overshooting on the probability of success? And how do you guys balance that internally yourselves?
So on our end, it's usually around the market assessment and less on the probability of success. I think especially for entrepreneurs with some very early assets, really the question is always, how do we turn this possibility into a probability, right? What are the experiments we need to run to start getting more and more comfortable that this technology is actually going to work and progress through clinical trials and eventually get to approval? But it's that market opportunity that's really where people get hung up. And it comes back to sort of this key question of, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should, right? And that's where being able to really dive into these competitive landscapes, understanding the standard of care, really digging into the market opportunities, the reimbursement dynamics, really kind of help kind of distill that, because the greatest technology in the world, if there's not really a need for it that clinicians are going to use and that are going to get reimbursed, that path to what it's worth is just much more difficult and just not potentially nearly as large. So typically that's where we see sort of the misalignment with the work we do and some of the views that entrepreneurs might have as they come to us.
Excellent. When you think a little bit about this, do you see investing in a new drug in the same way as you see investing in kind of a medical device? And we kind of walked through that, but our audience is a little bit more med tech heavy, right, in the nature of this. And so, are there any kind of big forewarnings that you might say, balance one versus the other?
So I think there are some different questions that we come out to kind of, I would say, between idea and to market. But I think, again, at the end of the day, is there a market for what you're creating? But as we view risk on the med tech side, it's more thinking about, what is the technical risk? What is the, maybe a little heavier focus on COGS than we might have on the drug side. You can look right now where there's an issue with chips and supply chain, right? Or is that going to be something that's going to impact you? So, the questions might be different depending if it's a therapeutic or med tech. But but all of those are all, I mean, that's a little bit more on the technical risk. Again, if the market size is there and we can get comfortable on how you're going to de-risk, the biology or the trials you might need to run, it really ends up being, the same types of questions as the therapeutic. It's just what's behind the scenes and how is that going to change the math. I would also say for medtech, that's where there's a little bit more focus on better revenue modeling as we think about what a launch might look like versus therapeutics. Again, it's not straightforward, but it's a little bit easier to do sort of that napkin math I laid out in my slideshow.
This is maybe a little bit of a selfish question for me that always intrigues me, and you kind of hit on it a little bit, but does reimbursement matter and payer, payer kind of impact of all this? As you guys, we talked a little bit about fast follower, we talked a little bit about, et cetera. How does that all play out for you guys?
I mean, in the ideal world, it shouldn't matter, right? If you're getting innovative drugs to the right people and there is, controls set in place to make sure that, I'll say our founders spoken about this at length, but ways to eventually have those drugs or devices go generic, then it shouldn't be an issue. But I think it is one that we continue to face, and we need to, keep a finger on the pulse of, what is, what are politicians both saying and actually trying to do. How do we get in touch with the payers and providers to understand just how they view these things? They're all kind of, wrapped up into the core of everything that we're trying to tackle. But again, at the end of the day, the hope is that good science, good data, should find a way to get the reimbursement that they should deserve to get those into the hands of patients.
Yeah, I agree. We should hope. It just often, unfortunately, doesn't play out that way with payers more often than not.
It is. I mean, it's always in any opportunity we look at, especially as they get closer to revenue. That's always, one of the key questions. How do we start dissecting this reimbursement and payer situation for a specific drug or device?
Right. One of the things that we've often talked about, and I think when we first started talking, we talked about this idea of focus ultrasound being this platform technology, and how should we think about it being a platform? Whether should entrepreneurs think of it as a platform technology and approach it that way, or should they think about it in a sole indication, you think, in terms of being able to kind of manage probability of success, as they develop their products?
It's a great question, and we see this all the time with any platform that we look at, is trying to find the right balance between multiple shots on goal, right? So you don't want if you have a really cool technology, you want to make sure that you have multiple opportunities to find success. You have multiple killer apps, right? Really, what's going to let this technology shine. But what we often find is that the further afield the spaces that you're trying to play in are, a little bit harder to, for us to get conviction that you're going to be able to do all of that. So for example, if you were to come in and say that, this technology is going to be used in oncology, and we're also going to spin it up and run trials in neuroscience, and we're thinking about doing it in autoimmune diseases as well. So my question is, are you building 3 different teams that are kind of comfortable and capable of doing clinical trial design in very disparate spaces? There's a little bit of question on our end of what's the, are you going to be focused enough, right? So typically what we tend to see, and I think, folks tend to get a lot of traction, is if you think about, these big buckets of diseases as a way to play, right? So if you think about, let's start in oncology, right? If you were to say, we're just going to go after breast cancer, that might be too limited. But if you say we're going to have, indicate we're going to go after breast cancer, non-small cell, and a handful of others for these reasons, that's, gives us multiple shots on goal, but within an area that we know that, you don't need to build 3 or 4 different teams to feel like you have the expertise to run there. And then usually what happens then, if that ends up working, then you add in those additional, opportunities later down the line, or you spin that out in a separate entity. There's other ways you can play with that, but typically that's what we seem to resonate most with, is if you can play in a big bucket, but in a big bucket where you can have multiple shots on goal across different indications.
This is a good question that kind of came into the Q&A, and because you guys go from venture to crossover, and you take the journey the entire way, but I'll read it directly. So how do you handle an idea that's missing some components? For example, the science looks great, but the team has no experience with the regulatory expansion of that idea into a true company. Would somebody like RA or others, do you see them being comfortable adding these needed items, or would they tend to avoid them because it's just not a complete package? And so given that you go from super early stage to late, how do you guys typically handle something like that?
So that's, we would view those types of as companies as being a bit more on the build side, a bit more on the venture side, which I think is why having this multi-stage approach is really valuable, because we can see where there might be a really cool idea that just needs the right team around it. And, the folks here have been doing it for a while now. So we know the people to reach out to, how to help you build that team. What are the questions you should be asking from a recruiting standpoint? Sometimes teams, have that all figured out and they have other investors that can kind of provide that support, in which case we can come in later in the game and provide more just guidance and feedback on how you should be positioning the story for the public markets, or, thinking about how you transition from being a private company to a public facing company, right? So it's really, I think the question as you evaluate and look at investors is, not only what are your needs today, but what will be your needs in the future, and making sure that you're reaching out and building a syndicate that can kind of help you along the way. The great thing about the multi-stage is that we hope that we can provide all of that, but there's plenty of awesome peers out there that are really good at a subset, and then know when it's time to kind of guide you to the next kind of group that can help you get to that next phase of development and next phase of your potential public trajectory.
Gotcha. I've got one more, and then we'll just filter through a few more if there are any more coming through Q&A. I've been staring at this TechAtlas for a while now. It blows my mind every single time I look at it, just how deep and detailed it is, and just really how it maps out everything. In the case of Focus Ultrasound, we've got mature, companies to just early stage, still working in the clinic. And so if I'm John or Jane Smith, early entrepreneurs, how do I incorporate such a complex model into the work stream with limited resource? How do I think about how I can kind of capture this or bring it into my workflow process?
So I think I think there's a couple of things. I think one is finding, investors that add that value, beyond capital. Again, this is, TechAtlas has been one of our secret sauces, but there's plenty of groups out there that have been investing for years and are, understanding of these spaces that you might be interested in. So again, how do you find the right outside people, especially as you're early on in the stage of your company, to provide some of that support for you? And then the other thing I would add is, it's hard to be, I think, part of the biotech innovation system if you're not on top of, staying on top of Twitter, staying on top of endpoints and Fierce Biotech, Fierce MedTech, basically all of these trade journals, going to conferences, all of these ways to just see what are your peers out there doing. It's not a great way to network, but it's a great way to, you might not be able to dig into the depth that we do, but you at least know who are the key players in the spaces you're in. What are the data that they're generating? How should you start thinking about the comparables that you'd want to compare yourself to as you're, looking to raise money? I think that's another one. And then at some point, especially as these companies grow, this really does become an in-house, I think, a lift as you think about somebody who can do sort of strategic planning, pipeline prioritization, portfolio prioritization. Eventually, this ends up becoming a full-time role as your company continues to grow. So I think from the early stage, just kind of try to get as in tuned into the biotech ecosystem as you can. Find smart and don't necessarily even need to be smart, but investors who are familiar in the space that can help provide that guidance, and then recognize when there's enough work that it's time to kind of bring that expertise in-house.
So I'm going to put you on the spot with maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable question, but when you look at Focus Ultrasound, from a 30,000 foot view, what's your kind of investor TechAtlas perspective tell you?
Yeah, so I think that there's the two spaces that I gravitate towards. I think first is better enabling oncology, which is why I focused on the breast cancer map. I think we just have a whole host of awesome drugs out there that we've never really, I think there's still potential to be unleashed, right? If PD-1s are only working in 30-40% of cancer, why aren't they working in all of them? Some of them just might not be responsive. Some of them might be, they just need a little bit of jumpstart to get there, and focused ultrasound might be the way to enable that, or to enable, ways to get, drugs where they wouldn't necessarily go otherwise. And then I think in the neuro bucket, blood-brain barrier penetrance, I think, is a big one as we think about, the next generation of drugs. But also that's just it's one of those spaces where most things just don't work. And I think there's some interesting kind of early on data with focused ultrasound. Then I think just that I think that there's potential there of, it's big enough space and there's a big enough unmet need there that it's worth continuing to explore, because I think we've barely scraped the surface of, how do we target these different neuro disorders, whether it's behavioral or degeneration, there's a variety out there. Focus ultrasound seems like the one that would fit well in that space as well. So those are, I think, the two big ones that I gravitate to, because those are the two biggest unmet needs, as I view, in our population, right? It's cancer's, really not going away. So how do we treat it better? And again, neuro is just so complicated, risk is really high, but I think the reward, both from an investment standpoint, but really for patients as well, is really there.
Well, listen, Eric, you've been more than complimentary with your time. And so let us just say thank you on behalf of the foundation. I know there's a few questions we didn't get to coming in through the chat. Probably a little bit more better if I answer those offline. You can reach my contact information on the website. Happy to address any of those questions around valuation multiples, walking through dilution of Series A, B, C, et cetera work. I'm happy to address any and all of those offline. So Eric, thank you again. We appreciate RA's time. We appreciate your time especially. And we look forward to speaking with you more in the future. Thanks, Eric, very much.
So it was my pleasure. Thank you all for the time, and I appreciate the invite. So again, if there's anything I can be helpful with, please let me know.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Have a great day.